Ethan thought Olivia was already behind him, but the truth was much heavier than that, because even after the marriage ended, even after the distance, even after he started trying to build something new with Tegan, Olivia's shadow was still sitting in the middle of his life, shaping the way he talked, the way he dated, the way he trusted people, and the way he explained why another relationship started, slipping away before it ever had a real chance to become stable. This was not just Ethan saying he had moved on and then finding a new girlfriend, because that would be the clean version, the easy version, the version people like to tell when they want their life to look under control. But what actually happened was much more uncomfortable, because Ethan stepped into a new relationship while the old one was still unfinished legally, emotionally, and mentally. And that meant Tegan was not walking into an empty room. She was walking into a room that still had Olivia's name written all over the walls. The painful part is that Ethan did seem to want peace, and that is what makes this story complicated, because he was not acting like someone who wanted more chaos, more fighting, or more emotional damage. He seemed like someone who wanted to breathe again, someone who wanted a relationship that felt simple, warm, calm, and safe. But wanting peace is not the same as being ready for it, especially when a person has not fully understood why the last relationship became so painful in the first place. With Olivia, the problems were never only about one argument or one family visit or one bad conversation, because their marriage carried pressure from almost every direction, from the tension with Ethan's parents, to the boundaries Olivia wanted, to Ethan's loyalty conflict, to the way both of them seemed to grow into completely different versions of themselves. And once politics, beliefs, family expectations, communication issues, and years of resentment all started stacking together, the marriage stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a battlefield where both people believed they were the one trying to survive. And that is why Tegan matters in this story. Because she was not just the next person Ethan dated after Olivia. She became the test of whether Ethan had actually changed. Whether he could love someone without carrying the same silence, delay, frustration, and emotional confusion into the next chapter. And at first, that chapter looked hopeful, because Ethan described the connection as real, meaningful, and peaceful, the kind of connection that makes a person believe life might finally be opening again after everything collapsed. But then the same question keeps coming back, and it is the question that makes this whole situation feel so heavy. Was Ethan truly building something new with Tegan, or was he still trying to escape the wreckage of Olivia? Because when Ethan later says the unresolved divorce affected his relationship with Tegan, that is not a small detail. That is the warning sign sitting right in the center of the story. And even if viewers believe Ethan had valid frustration, the bigger issue is that his life was not emotionally clear when Tegan entered it, since Olivia was gone from the relationship, but not gone from the consequences. And that left Ethan stuck between the woman he lost, the woman he wanted, and the version of himself he still had not fully figured out. So before anyone can understand why Ethan and Tegan did not work, the story has to go back to Olivia, because the second relationship did not fall apart in isolation. It was built on top of a marriage that had already changed Ethan's relationship with his family, his trust, his identity, and maybe even his idea of what love was supposed to feel like. Before Tegan ever became part of Ethan's story, there was Olivia, and the painful thing about Ethan and Olivia's marriage is that it did not collapse in one clean moment where everyone could point to a single mistake and say, this is where it ended, because what really happened was slower, heavier, and much harder to untangle, with years of family tension, loyalty tests, silence, resentment, different beliefs, and unmet emotional needs building underneath them until the marriage started carrying more pressure than love could easily hold. At one point, Ethan stood in front of his parents and made it clear that Olivia was not just someone standing beside him, she was the person he had chosen. And if his parents could not accept her, then they were not going to get access to him either. And that moment matters because it shows Ethan was not always sitting somewhere in the middle trying to please everyone. He was willing to draw a hard line for his wife, even if that meant walking away from the family world that had shaped almost everything about him. But that is also where the story becomes uncomfortable, because Ethan's choice in that moment does not erase what came later. And later, after the marriage fell apart, the same family system that once felt like the source of so much conflict became the place Ethan slowly started returning to. Reconnecting with his father, spending time with his siblings, showing up at the farm, and finding pieces of comfort in the childhood world that Olivia seemed to question so deeply. That reversal is what makes the marriage so complicated, because for Olivia, Distance from that world may have felt necessary, maybe even protective, while for Ethan, that same world still carried memories, family ties, music, land, cars, siblings, and a sense of home that he never fully stopped needing. So even when Ethan defended Olivia, there was still a part of him tied to the life she was pushing against. And that kind of split can quietly tear two people apart before they even understand what they are really fighting about. On the surface, they were fighting about parents, boundaries, visits, family conversations, and the kind of behavior Olivia would or would not tolerate. But underneath that, they seemed to be fighting over something much deeper, which was the question of where Ethan belonged, because Olivia wanted a life that moved away from the control and pain she connected to the past, while Ethan seemed to need a way to keep parts of that past without feeling like he was betraying his wife. And the tragedy is that both sides can make emotional sense, which is exactly why this was never a simple story. Because Ethan looked hurt when he felt Olivia was not accepted. Olivia looked overwhelmed by a family dynamic she did not trust. Ethan wanted loyalty, Olivia wanted separation, Ethan wanted peace, Olivia wanted safety. And somewhere between those needs, their marriage became a place where both people seemed to feel unseen. Even Ethan's later reflections about communication make the story feel heavier, because he admits that he was not good at opening up, and when he talks with Barry, he recognizes a pattern that feels familiar, a man who can be present but not fully emotionally available, a man who keeps moving through life while important feelings stay buried, and once that pattern enters a marriage, small problems stop being small because every unsaid thing starts collecting interest like emotional debt, because apparently even silence charges late fees. That is why the cooking argument matters more than it sounds like it should. Because it was never only about food or who stood in the kitchen. It was about Ethan feeling cared for, feeling thought of, feeling loved in the language he understood, while Olivia may have heard something much bigger and more painful inside that complaint, something connected to old expectations about gender, marriage, duty, and what a wife is supposed to be. So when Ethan later says Olivia is no longer in the picture, that statement may be true in one way, but emotionally it is not that simple, because once Olivia was gone, Ethan could move differently with his family, hug his mother, reconnect with his father, visit siblings, and make choices without weighing how it would affect his marriage. Yet that freedom also raises the question that follows him into everything after her. Was Ethan finally healing, or was he only rewriting the story now that the person who challenged his old world was no longer standing beside him? This is where Ethan and Olivia's story becomes impossible to reduce to one clean side, because the more you look at what happened between them, the less it feels like a simple marriage breakdown, and the more it feels like two people standing in the same fire and walking out with completely different explanations for why they got burned. For Ethan, the pain seems tied to the idea that Olivia's conflict with his family slowly turned everything into drama, distance, resentment, and pressure. Because the family that he came from was not just a group of people in the background of his life. It was the farm, the younger siblings, the old cars, the music, the quiet memories, the version of childhood he still looked back on with warmth. And even if he knew parts of that life were restrictive or imperfect, he never seemed ready to throw the whole thing away like it meant nothing. But for Olivia, that same world carried a very different meaning, because what Ethan could remember as home, she could experience as control, judgment, pressure, and a system she needed to get away from in order to understand herself. And that is the uncomfortable split at the center of this marriage, because one person was trying to protect the pieces of the past that still felt sacred, while the other person was trying to escape the parts of the past that felt suffocating. That is why this was never just about whether Ethan visited his parents, whether Olivia set boundaries, whether somebody cooked dinner, whether somebody said the wrong thing, or whether one argument went too far, because underneath all of those smaller moments was a much bigger fight over identity, over loyalty, over what healing should look like, and over whether a person can build a future while still holding on to a version of the past their partner believes nearly broke them. And this is exactly where viewers split, because some people will look at Ethan and see a man who finally started reclaiming his family after years of feeling pulled away from them, while others will look at Olivia and see a woman who was trying to protect herself from a family structure Ethan never fully understood from the outside, and then another group will say Ethan avoided hard conversations for too long, while another will say Olivia's boundaries became so firm that there was no room left for repair. The difficult truth is that none of those readings fully cancel out the others, which is what makes this story so emotionally unstable, because Ethan can be genuinely hurt by Olivia's rejection of his background, and Olivia can still have real reasons for wanting distance from that background, and Ethan can love his family without every family wound disappearing, and Olivia can want independence without every choice she made being perfect. What makes the tension even heavier is that after the marriage ends, Ethan starts finding peace in the exact places that once caused so much pressure in the relationship, reconnecting with his father, hugging his mother, spending time with his siblings, returning to the farm, remembering music and childhood, and slowly stepping back into a family world that seems easier to breathe in once Olivia is no longer standing beside him asking the harder questions. So now the real question is not just who was right, because that answer is too small for what actually happened. The real question is whether Ethan's peace came from healing or from finally removing the person who challenged his old world. And that question matters because when Tegan later enters his life, Ethan is not just looking for love, he may be looking for a relationship that feels calm, familiar, accepting, and untouched by the kind of conflict Olivia forced him to face. Tegan did not enter Ethan's life like a random rebound who appeared just to fill the empty space after Olivia, because the way Ethan talked about her made it feel like she represented something he had been craving for a long time, something calmer, softer, and less loaded with constant conflict. And that is what makes this part of the story feel hopeful at first, because after everything that happened with Olivia, Ethan seemed desperate for a relationship that did not feel like another emotional battlefield. Their beginning had a simple kind of warmth to it, with the motorcycle photo, the unexpected comment, the excitement of hearing back, the long-distance effort, the first date, and then Tegan wanting to see the town Ethan came from, asking about his childhood, listening to his stories, and showing interest in the parts of his life that mattered to him, and for Ethan, that attention seemed to mean more than casual curiosity, because after years of feeling like his past was being criticized or picked apart, Tegan's interest made him feel understood instead of judged. That is why the early scenes between them matter, because when Ethan shows her around, talks about the farm, the theater he never went to, the simple trips into town, the old rhythm of his childhood, and the way his world used to work, he is not just giving her background information, he is quietly watching whether she can accept the version of him that existed before marriage, before conflict, before divorce, before everything became complicated enough to require a family courtroom and several emotional disclaimers. And at first, Tegan seems to pass that test because she does not treat his upbringing like a joke or a crime scene. She listens, she asks questions, and she tries to understand how different his life was from hers, and that gives Ethan something he clearly wanted, the feeling that he could share his story without immediately having to defend it. But this is where the warning sign begins, because peace can feel like healing when a person has been living in conflict for too long, and sometimes what feels like love is also relief. And Ethan may have truly loved Tegan, but the bigger question is whether he was ready to build a life with her, or whether he was still standing with one foot inside the emotional wreckage of Olivia. The problem was not only that Tegan lived in Wisconsin and Ethan was in Minnesota, because long distance can be hard, but it is not automatically impossible. The deeper problem was that Ethan kept saying he would move, kept suggesting that the relationship could become more stable, but the action did not match the promise, and for someone waiting on the other side of distance, words can only carry weight for so long before they start feeling like a delay. And at the same time, Ethan's divorce from Olivia was still hanging over everything, not just as paperwork, but as pressure, because Ethan believed the unfinished divorce made it harder for him to move on and affected what he had with Tegan. Yet even inside that frustration, he also admitted something important. Tegan became tired of waiting, and he had told her more than once that he would move without actually doing it. That is the part that makes this relationship more painful than simple bad timing, because Ethan can say the divorce held him back, and maybe it did, but Tegan still had to live with the reality of a man who loved her, missed her, believed they had a rare connection, and still could not fully step into the future he kept talking about. So by the time Ethan says there is unfinished business with Tegan, it does not sound like a clean romantic confession. It sounds like a man realizing that the second chance he wanted may have been damaged by the same pattern that hurt the first one. Deep feelings, slow communication, delayed action, and the painful habit of understanding what love needed only after it had already started slipping away. By the end of all of this, the most painful truth about Ethan is not that he stopped loving Olivia, and it is not that Tegan was just some random person he used to distract himself from the divorce, because the real truth is much more complicated than that, and it is also much harder to admit. Ethan was trying to move forward, but he was still carrying the emotional shape of the marriage he had just left behind. He could say Olivia was no longer in the picture, and in the most basic way, that was true, because she was no longer standing beside him as his wife, no longer part of his daily decisions, no longer the person he had to check with before seeing his family, hugging his mother, reconnecting with his father, or spending time at the farm. But emotionally, Olivia was still there in every question Ethan had about love, loyalty, family, peace, resentment, and whether he could actually build something new without repeating the same patterns that had already cost him so much. That is why Tegan's place in this story matters, because she did not just show that Ethan could feel something again after Olivia. She showed whether Ethan had learned how to protect something while it was still alive. And that is where the story becomes quietly heartbreaking, because Ethan seemed to know he loved her. He seemed to know the connection was rare. He seemed to know she gave him a kind of peace he had been missing. But knowing that and acting on it are two very different things. And Ethan's biggest struggle was never only feeling, it was moving fast enough, clearly enough, and honestly enough before the other person finally ran out of patience. With Olivia, the resentment built slowly, until by the time Ethan could explain parts of it, the marriage was already too damaged to repair in a simple way. And with Tegan, the distance kept stretching. The promises kept sitting there, and the divorce kept hanging over everything like unfinished paperwork with emotional teeth, because apparently even love has to stand in line behind legal delays. And old heartbreak. But the important part is that Ethan's situation cannot be explained by blaming only Olivia, because while the delayed divorce may have created pressure and frustration, Ethan also admitted that Tegan was tired of long distance, and that he kept saying he would move without actually doing it. And that admission changes the whole meaning of the breakup, because it shows this was not just a man being blocked by his past. It was also a man struggling to turn his feelings into decisions before the future closed without him. So the final answer is not that Olivia destroyed his next chance, and it is not that Tegan was never serious, and it is not even that Ethan did not care enough, because he clearly cared. But caring is not always the same as being ready, and sometimes the most damaging thing a person can do is love someone sincerely while still being too delayed, too guarded, or too unsure to give that love the structure it needs. Ethan's next chapter will not be decided by whether he misses Tegan, because missing someone is easy after the door closes. The harder question is whether he has changed enough to stop waiting until the damage is already done. Because if there is still unfinished business, then the real test is not whether Tegan gives him another chance. It is whether Ethan has finally learned how to show up before love becomes another thing he has to explain after losing it.